Hey everybody, I hope you're having a good week. So, I'm going to do a video on trend lines. Now, trend lines are very important whenever it comes to trading stocks. They're not always 100%, but they're they're pretty dang close. It kind of depends on the time frame that you're looking at. Normally, the longer the time frame, the better the chance the trend line breaks or retests are going to be accurate. And it's always, everybody kind of worries about the hourly charts and the 4 minute charts and the 1 day charts, but if you look at the bigger picture, it's a better time, a way to make money. Okay, so you can look at trend lines from a daily up to a monthly. Just remember, the lower the time frame, the more fake outs that you're going to get. Now, I'm on TradingView, and if you want to draw some trend lines, I'll show you how to do that. So if we're looking at the first wave in Bitcoin cycle, or at least the first one that this chart is showing, back in 2013. This came out in 2009, but the data doesn't show because Kraken didn't exist back then. So you're going to come over here and you're going to press this trend line here. There's a couple different ways to draw trend lines. Some people will use candles, some people will use wicks. Okay, so your wick here would be the start of the trend line. Now, if you're using only wicks, right, you would have a trend line that comes all the way down here. Okay, now if you don't use wicks, right, you would have a trend line that looks a little bit different. Okay, so it kind of just depends. You kind of want to draw both of them really and just see how they relate to the price action. Now, we're on a weekly chart, okay? But once you break through a trend line, the odds are that you're going to go up to the next level of resistance. Okay, and sometimes you come back down to retest the trend line, but I just wanted to point out that trend lines do help predict price. Whenever you blast through a trend line, it's likely to go up a little bit. Sometimes you come back down to retest it, and then sometimes retest it again. However, if you're not using the wicks, right, you would have never broken this trend line until the bottom of the market was already in. So just keep that in mind, right? Once you broke through that major trend line, then price started going parabolic and then continued up from that point. So that's really helpful whenever it comes to catching the bottoms of certain cycles and long-term time frames. Now you also have trend lines that are from based on the bottom. You want to draw a trend line, you want the most amount of touches, right? So if we come down here, at least 2 touches, but the more the better. So you have 1 touch here, you have another touch right here, and pretty much at the top of the trend line. And that's how you would start the trend line, 2 touches. Okay, now right here you have 1, 2, 3, 4, pretty close to 5, and then as time goes on you get more touches and more touches and more touches. So it becomes a stronger and stronger trend line as you go from there. Okay, and it held this trend line really well here, and it held this trend line really well here. So the next one, right, you broke through, and you have trend lines for an upward market and then trend lines for a downward market. So how would we draw? You could start a small trend line right here, okay, because you have a touch here, you have touches here, and then you kind of knew that the market bottom was in because it broke past this level of resistance. And then you would draw another trend line once price went up again and say, okay, well, here's another trend line. It's kind of just riding that trend line. You might even draw it on the wick here. You got a wick, touch, a touch, touch, a touch. Okay, and then Bitcoin really, really starts to take off. Now you have another trend line. Okay, you would buy on this trend line, right? You'd buy, you started the trend line here, you would buy on this close touch, and then you would buy again on this close touch, as long as the price was, you knew the price was going to continue to go up. Okay, now you have another trend line. You have a touch here. Sometimes you can mix the wicks as well with the candles. It just kind of depends. So there's your next trend line. It didn't even touch it. It went even more parabolic, right? And then you can draw another trend line here. Boom, boom, touches this 3 times. And then once you start breaking these trend lines, it's a very big warning sign. Okay, so you broke here, top of the market might be in. Big concern. Once you break this trend line here, you're in really big trouble. And then you retested it and got rejected, and then really big trouble. Price dropped about 50% at this within a month or so on Bitcoin there. Okay, so that's how you can draw bull market trend lines and bear market trend lines. Now you can do this throughout the whole entire cycle. This is not the only thing that you want to be doing, right? You want to be looking at the indicators as well, but this is a very basic, helpful tool that you can use. In my Patreon, that's in the bio in my YouTube channel, I teach a group of people. I do 2 videos a week. I explain what I'm buying, what I'm selling, where I plan on buying something, and I make predictions on tops and bottoms of cycles. I teach Elliott Wave. I teach a bunch of different things for traders and people to kind of understand cryptocurrencies in general. Okay, so you have this next cycle in 2017. So how are we going to draw this trend line? So there's a short-term trend line here that we can draw, which is kind of a mix of the candles, the wicks, and the candles here. So you broke through this, but without looking at the other indicators, you probably would have thought this was the bottom of the cycle here, and then once we broke through, maybe retesting the trend line and then starting to go up from that point. That's not exactly what happened. So that's why you need to understand other things within the charts. Now you have another trend line right here. You broke through it as well here, and it was a big fake out, looked like a retest, and then you started to go down. But again, you need to pay attention to the other indicators in the chart. Now you can draw this third trend line, and once we actually broke through this trend line, bull market was on. Okay. So if we get rid of all these drawings and we go back to the bottom of the market here, you created a new trend line. Okay, because you have a touch here, you have a touch here, and then you have created a new trend line here as well. Okay, I'm not really using the wicks on this one. You could probably even draw this down a little bit more. But since we have all the data, I'm going to draw it up here because you have closes. Now you've created a big pattern here, which is a very bullish pattern, right? And once you broke through this trend line, you retested it, you retested. A lot of people were in fear. They thought that because it dropped 70% here, that we were just going to have another fake out and it was going to go to $2,000 or $1,000. And human emotion is a big killer of your portfolio, and understanding technical analysis helps remove that fear. Now once you broke that, you started to go parabolic again. Now there is another trend line that you can use, which is from the wicks here. Okay, and you broke through. Once you broke through that, you retested the trend line, which is very, very common, and then you started going up. Now, how are we going to do this? Trend line's not super helpful, right? You can look at this, you really even closed below it a few times. So short-term trend line or long-term trend line. The long-term trend line is stronger. Now, but if you want to draw a trend line here, where does that take you to? Basically takes you to the next point where we bounced from. Okay, and once you closed below this long trend line right here, stuff started going down really bad. Okay, and then you have a short-term trend line here. Once you close below that, big problems. Once you close below trend lines at the top of a cycle, and you kind of know where the top of the cycle is around typically, once you break trend lines, you can bet it's probably bear market time. Not always, but there's a good chance for that. Once you break bull market trend lines, big concern. Okay, so let's get rid of all those drawings again. Let's do it again. Okay, this will be the last time. So you have a trend line here, you got to touch here, you got to touch here, and then what happened? So once you broke above that, you retested it once, you retested it again, and then you had your bull market really start to take off here. You have a trend line that leads from here all the way. This is an entire bull market trend line. Okay, you have a couple rough closes above and below, but ultimately you have your entire cycle, which this hasn't ever happened on BTC, that stayed on one trend line. And then once we broke it, bad news. Okay, so now on Bitcoin, all right, we can get rid of this. And this is the most recent price. Right, so what are we looking at on BTC right now? Okay, you see that? That's your trend line break. So based on everything that I showed you, what do you kind of think is going to happen from this point? And I discussed this in the Patreon. My members know what I think is likely to happen and what is possible to happen from this point. So if you are interested, you should check it out. And you get 2 weekly videos a week. You get to ask me any questions that relate to crypto or Bitcoin, stocks in general, indicators, hardware devices, exchanges, staking, anything that has to do with crypto. You can feel free to reach out. There's a chat group that I get to daily, and I post informational news weekly as well. Hope you enjoyed it. Hopefully this is helpful, and I'll talk to you in the next video.